The International Monetary Fund today released the report of its Article 4 consultation with Nigeria. That report highlighted a number of existing challenges and drew attention to emerging issues around ways and means financing, the new Naira notes, and a whole lot more. Now, the latest IMF report on Nigeria comes a week after Moody's and S&P Global issued sovereign ratings on Africa's biggest economy. My guest on this is Bongo. He's a professor of economics at the Lagos Business School. Thanks for connecting into the studio tonight for the show, Professor. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Bosun.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Professor Adi. Give me your first word on this latest Article 4 consultation report on Nigeria.
Well, I mean, they haven't said anything that watchers of Nigeria's economy are not aware of or have not spoken about in recent times. So it's the same thing that we've been concerned, elevated downside risk, as well as the current issues regarding macroeconomic management. So the same thing that everybody has been talking about. So it's nothing different from what we've known. And again, I'm happy you mentioned the Moody S&P's rating. The same conclusions they reach is exactly what Article 4 has also come to. So it's nothing surprising. So yeah, that is it.
It's not surprising, but saying the same thing over and over again as far as Nigeria is concerned in this Article 4, which is like an annual kind of review, having a meeting with the government. So when you look at an Article 4 consultation from the IMF, how is it really arrived at? And if the IMF keeps saying you need to do this repeatedly over a 1, 2, 3, 4 year period, what does that really mean in terms of how responsive our governance process and everything are in terms of making those necessary changes that we need to have?
Yeah, what the IMF does is to recommend, policy directions based on their understanding of things. But then the ultimate decision to act, rests upon the government or the monetary policy makers of member countries. So Article 4, visitation by the IMF is a routine thing that happens sometimes biannually, but usually annual review of economic development, especially from the macroeconomic point of view. Last week, we had an audience with the World Bank at the Lagos Business School where they came to present some of their reports, and I was a discussant in that. So one of the questions that the IMF, the World Bank got from the audience was, why do they keep, talking to government when it is clear that government has no intention to listen to them? So, and then how do they ensure that they make sure, that government listens to them? And then because they were talking about rising debt and all of that, just as IMF has also raised the issues with respect to debt servicing. Now, why would you keep giving loans to countries when you know that there is an escalating risk of them not being able to repay? So that means you are helping to worsen the situation. So, of course, they couldn't answer that question. So I think that the same could go to IMF with respect to their Article 4, some of the things they mentioned. At the center of it is the rising debt profile and the difficulty that will arise from servicing those debts going forward. So they mentioned that, they expect that the subsidy, petroleum subsidy will be removed in the middle of the year. So that means they are looking forward to the new administration having to do that. But at the same time, the new administration will have to confront this whole debt because it's not going to disappear with this current administration. It's debt that's been incurred. And then if you look at the global conditions, as the Article 4 also mentioned, higher interest rates as central banks all over the world try to rein in this rampage in inflation. So that means the cost of borrowing is going to go up, and then the sovereign ratings of a country such as ours will keep diminishing. So that before we know it, we may be even facing default situation.
Yes.
Talking about default, I don't know if you're familiar that this week one of the most successful project finance infrastructure investments in West Africa, the Azura power plant, having, about to face a default and a $1 million loan they're not able to service. So when you look at that, so we are seeing very difficult, headwinds that I don't know how the next administration will deal with.
This is a very important conversation as we are trying to cross the bridge from the current administration to the next one. So the IMF report says near-term outlook faces downside risks while there are upside risks in the medium term. So we have a near-term outlook and medium-term upside risk. Clarify that for me.
Well, so when they say the near-term, the near-term downside risk, of course, it is the global inflation that everybody's talking about, which has raised, food prices everywhere in the world. We are not left out. And then we also have, in addition to that, because they didn't even mention the fuel crisis that is roiling the country right now. So that is another issue that raises, the near-term upside risk. Then, downside risk. Of course, they mentioned the issues of climate change as well as one of the, because many parts of Nigeria are facing flooding. I didn't also read about them talking about security issues in Nigeria. It means that they downplayed that. So that's also another issue. But then when you talk about the upside risk, that's what are the prospects? Are we going to have a tailwind, something that will push us forward? So that will happen if there is a stability in oil production. And then if prices continue to be where it is now up. But then again, given the volatility in that industry, we cannot count on it. This is a country that depends essentially on oil price. So they talked about, the current, our current, current account that has been somehow robust in the past few years. Then we've returned to growth, pre-COVID growth level. And then they projected that we've grown at 3%. So when you look at that, the resurgence in consumption and then the stability in oil price, although we haven't quite taken advantage of all of that, as they also mentioned. So those are some of the upside risks that they mentioned. But then that will happen in the long term. But in the short term, we have these challenges that we have to deal with. The debt profile of the country is a very serious one. But they didn't cover all the angles, like I said. Yeah, social, economic, and political risks, again, are all there, but they didn't mention it in that report.
Well, the directors of the IMF in this particular report recommended, and I'm going to quote, decisive fiscal and monetary tightening. They asked the Nigerian government to take decisive actions in terms of tightening fiscal and monetary issues. So, do you have an idea what this decisive action should be, and how urgent they think they should be tightened?
Yeah, but we have to look at the effectiveness of that, because even on this channel, you and I have argued the issue of the neutrality and the sterility of monetary policy in recent times. So no matter what the central bank does with respect to monetary tightening, that is raising the MPR, the monetary rate, and all of that, so it hasn't quite had the expected impact. I'm happy that they mentioned
But the IMF in this report is also asking the central bank to stand by and be ready to increase policy rate if needed.
Yeah, but I'm telling you that I don't think that is a wise. Well, I won't say that, but it doesn't really show that they understand the situation. I'm saying that central bank actions in recent times have not had the expected effect. Remember, that notes as well in the report, in the first few paragraphs, they mentioned that there is the anchoring of inflation expectations, which means that what the central bank expects inflation to be is not actually what it is. So, meaning that whatever they are doing is not having the expected effect in reining in inflation. And then we are seeing that in other countries that tried so many measures, monetary tightening, that hawkish monetary policy stance that never yielded results. So when you have a situation where you have low growth and high inflation, I'm not sure that using the conventional monetary policy tools work. So we have to look at the unorthodox policy measures as Korea has adopted. But the IMF seemed hard-bent on raising rates increasingly. But again, I think there is a limit to which, beyond which the central bank cannot afford to raise rates. Already, in the past half a year, it's gone like 600 basis points. That's 6 points more than, June last year.
In what areas do you think the fiscal authorities need to tighten things?
So they mentioned the ways and means advances that have been abused by the current central bank. we've also raised that issue. That's why I said there's nothing new in what they report. So we've decried that all over. In fact, if you check 2012 in a decade, money supply has grown by more than 226%. In 2012, we had a money supply of about 15 trillion naira. But today, I'm talking about M3. But today you have, at the end of 2022, you have M3 that's gone beyond 50 trillion naira.
Well,
so
that's government borrowing. That's government borrowing. It's the government that borrows from the central bank. So it's the government that says, look, I own you, the central bank. I want you to print. I want you to loan me this money. So it's the government that is borrowing. So you look at Ghana, for example. Ghana also did excessive borrowing, $3.3 billion.
Abusing our Fiscal Responsibility Act. Remember, the Fiscal Responsibility Act limited it to just 2% of the budget, and not just that. It also ensured that it has to be repaid at the end of the fiscal year. It's not supposed to be carried over. But now they are talking about securitizing it, and I'm really not happy that IMF is supporting the central bank to securitize those ways and means abuse, not advances. I don't think that, that's IMF, but we cannot swallow everything they tell us hook, line, and sinker.
Well, part of the latest Article 4 report, which was released today, asks the central bank to phase out credit intervention programs and sterilize fiscal deficits.
Yeah, so of course we've always talked about that. That's been something every economist, everybody in Nigeria has been saying. So Central Bank of Nigeria under MFLA took upon themselves the role of development bank, trade bank, whatever bank, and then sponsoring a number of things. Actually, they distorted the system by lending at a lower rate than the market. So this is exactly what caused the subprime lending crisis in the US in the 2007, that triggered the global financial meltdown. That's exactly what we've seen. So you may call it quantitative easing or whatever. Maybe it has worked in some circles, but in our own case, it has not worked, right? But they continue to do it. So I think IMF is telling them to stop that. Stop funding all of those things and stop competing with the commercial banks for lending. So they need to bring everything into harmony. Also, they mentioned, the harmonization of the exchange rate, removing all those windows. Of course, everybody has mentioned that. That's what we've done. In fact, when you read that, it will appear that IMF, read one of the. I've read the manifestos of the various presidential candidates, but I'm more familiar with that of P2P. In fact, what they wrote there is exactly what you find in P2P's manifesto regarding what he needs to do.
Okay, so we need to do a couple of things very quickly. How does this latest IMF report, Article 4, stand with the recent rating actions of Moody's and S&P Global in terms of putting Nigeria, as far as Moody's concerned, putting Nigeria just near non-investment grade level or junk level, and then the S&P came in and said, well, look, between stable and relatively negative outlook, that's where we are right now.
Well, yeah, so IMF wasn't that, they started by the positive note that we've managed to return to pre-COVID level of growth. And I'm sure, the IMF and Moody's and S&P focusing on different aspects of the economy. Now, Moody's, they looked at the various, where the risk crystallized, whether it's social, political, economic, climate, and all of that. So they put all of those together. So that is more robust. So when you put that together, you bring in issues of climate change, you bring in security and insecurity in the system and all manner of things. And of course, political instability, because this is a election year. So you understand how risky it is and then how the position of risk is usually very high. So putting that together, Moody's is more comprehensive and more rigorous in the sense that they brought everything into bear. And that's what led them to give us that junk status. So that is more, I would say, more realistic, more objective, because it captures all the risk elements that we face in the nation today. But again, the recommendation of Moody is not different from that of IMF, that we have to harmonize the exchange rate, we have to remove fuel subsidy, we have to run a transparent and government, and then we also have to embark on urgent fiscal reform. So those are the things that both agree in. And then, of course, every watcher of Nigerian economy says the same thing.
Professor Hadi, in 30 seconds, what about the new Naira notes deadline, February the 10th?
Yeah, so you see, actually, I was speaking earlier in the day in the class, about this, because we also have to note that the central bank is independent. So what I don't know is whether Supreme Court has the powers to really, compel the central bank to its own line of action or whatever. I don't have any problem with the changing in the currency, but the only issue here is the way it has been carried out. It looks like the CBN wasn't prepared. They didn't quite anticipate the reaction that the general public will have. But then whether this is something that needs to happen in this economy to reset our mindset, because people are not looking at the psychological, aspect of this, because this is an economy that runs on cash and carry. And the implications of that. When you run a cash and carry economy, the premium is too high. People pay doubly more than they could pay for things. We don't have a credit system. So I think what the CBN is doing is to encourage us to reset our mindset so that we begin to, think towards running a credit-based economy. And then there is no economy that is poised for growth anywhere in the world that doesn't have a very sustainable and effective credit system. But that's exactly what we don't have here. So I'm thinking that this is the first step in the right direction. But then the way it has been implemented leaves a lot to be desired. Of course, they are doing their best. I don't think they should pull back. I'm not in support of the central bank, the Supreme Court judgment, because again, it's parochial, because that was a judgment that was procured by some segment of the Nigerian elite. It's not general. I don't think that it represents the consensus. Yes, people are suffering, but I sympathize with people who have been affected negatively by this. But then our economy needs to run on better footing so that it could be better managed.
Bongo Adi, Professor of Economics at the Lagos Business School. Enjoy your evening, and we really appreciate this robust conversation. Thank you. See you next time.